What happens when a seasoned cop goes too far? What happens when a peaceful civil rights attorney is wrongfully detained? Naomi Williams, a black woman, found herself caught in a tense and unjust arrest that would ignite a movement for justice. Will the police department be held accountable, or will this just be another story forgotten? Watch the shocking events unfold, only here on H2 Black Thread. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Oak Ridge had always been a place that prided itself on its progressive values. A small city with big dreams, it was known for its diversity and open-mindedness, a place where people from all walks of life could find a sense of belonging. Yet, as much as Oak Ridge tried to show itself as modern and inclusive, there were still shadows lingering under the surface. And Officer Jason Turner, a veteran of the Oak Ridge Police Department, was one of the embodiments of that shadow. Turner had been on the force for over 15 years, a long time in a town that didn't see much crime. He was known for his stern demeanor, his quick judgments, and a tendency to uphold the law with what some called an iron fist. He had earned his reputation through years of service, but not everyone was a fan of his methods. While his record appeared flawless on paper, a string of quieter complaints followed him, murmurs of bias and prejudice from the very community he swore to protect. Turner's actions rarely met consequences, as many of his colleagues had learned to look the other way. They all knew about his short temper, his tendency to see things in black and white, but no one dared to challenge him, not directly at least. He liked it that way. He knew how to work the system, how to navigate the unspoken code among officers. They might turn a blind eye to his flaws, but they also backed him up when needed. It was this silent, unspoken support that kept him in his position. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Turner had long learned to use his rank, his badge, and the weight of his authority to get what he wanted, without much resistance. After all, Oak Ridge was a small town, and the people here were used to the rules. They didn't question the law, and they certainly didn't question him. But that rainy afternoon, things were different. Turner was on traffic patrol, something he hated. He had recently been demoted after an internal investigation into his conduct. The details of that incident were vague, but everyone in the department knew what happened. Turner had gotten too comfortable with his power, and it had cost him. So he was stuck on traffic duty, monitoring the rain-soaked streets of Oak Ridge. He wasn't happy about it. In fact, he was bitter. His hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly, his fingers tapping rhythmically in frustration. He sat in his cruiser at a busy intersection, watching the world go by through a sheet of rain on the window, his mind wandering. It was just another day on the job, but Turner's mind couldn't let go of the past, of the days when he was in control, when people obeyed him without question. As he stared out into the gray mist of the rain, he couldn't shake off the feeling that his power was slipping away. He wasn't the same man he used to be. The uniform, the badge, it all felt heavier now. He sighed deeply, his frustration simmering just below the surface as the cars passed by in a never-ending stream. Then, his eyes landed on a silver sedan that had pulled up to a red light. A woman, a black woman, was sitting in the driver's seat, speaking into her phone through a Bluetooth device. She was calm, relaxed even, nodding along to the conversation. Turner's eyes narrowed. He didn't know why, but something about her stood out to him. Maybe it was the way she was speaking, so confident, so sure of herself. Maybe it was the way she seemed completely unaware of his presence, as if she was too comfortable, too self-assured. Turner didn't like that. In his world, people like her didn't just coast through life with such ease. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, his mind already racing, forming a narrative, crafting a justification for what was to come. Violation, he muttered to himself under his breath. She was on her phone. That was enough. And that, in his mind, was all the reason he needed to pull her over. As the light turned green and the silver sedan started moving, Turner flicked on his sirens, the sharp sound cutting through the quiet of the street. The car pulled over without hesitation, and Naomi, still unaware of what was coming, turned off the engine and placed her hands on the steering wheel, waiting. Turner felt a sense of satisfaction wash over him. He was in control again. The storm inside him calmed, and he gathered himself as he stepped out of the cruiser. He adjusted his uniform, straightened his back, and approached the driver's side window. He was ready. His movements were mechanical, practiced. "License and registration," he barked, his voice stern. Naomi glanced up, her eyes meeting his, but she didn't flinch. There was a calmness about her, an air of composure that unsettled him. Her smile was polite, but there was something else in it, something he couldn't place. She didn't appear nervous, didn't seem to be intimidated by his badge. "Good afternoon, officer." "Can I ask why I'm being pulled over?" she replied, her tone professional but with an underlying hint of curiosity. Turner's lips tightened. "You were on your phone while driving. That's illegal." His voice was firm, matter-of-fact, but a small part of him felt the irritation bubbling beneath his skin. Naomi didn't react as he had hoped. She didn't panic, didn't scramble to defend herself. Instead, she simply replied with the same calm composure. "With all due respect, sir, I was using my hands-free device, which is permitted by law." Turner's jaw clenched. She was right, of course, but he wasn't going to let her win this easily. He was the one in charge here. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone rising just a bit, enough to let her know he was serious. Naomi hesitated for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly as she tried to understand what was happening. "Is there a specific reason, officer? I believe I've complied with all of your requests." But Turner wasn't interested in her reasoning. He needed control, and this woman was threatening it. He wanted her to obey, and if she didn't, then he would make her. "Step out of the vehicle now," he demanded, his voice no longer just a command, but an ultimatum. The tension in the air was palpable as Naomi slowly opened her door and stepped out of the car. She moved deliberately, her hands still visible. Turner, however, was already losing his patience. Without warning, he grabbed her arm, twisting it behind her back and pushing her against the side of the car. Naomi winced at the sudden force, but she didn't struggle. Instead, she remained calm, composed. "Officer, this is unnecessary," she said quietly, her voice still steady. "I am not resisting." But Turner wasn't listening. He was too far gone in his own sense of power. He slapped handcuffs around her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin as he read her rights in a mechanical tone. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and obstruction." Naomi didn't fight. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. Instead, she stood there, calm and collected, as Turner's actions spiraled further out of control. The air between Officer Jason Turner and Naomi Williams grew heavier with each passing second. Naomi's voice remained calm, her posture composed, but there was an unmistakable tension in the air. Turner had already made up his mind, but Naomi wasn't making it easy for him. "License and registration, please," Turner repeated, his voice clipped, as if the request was a mere formality. He had no intention of letting the situation go quietly. Naomi, however, had already complied with his earlier requests and was now focused on understanding why she was being stopped in the first place. Naomi's response was polite, but there was an edge to it. "I believe I've followed all the regulations. I'm using a hands-free device, which is perfectly legal. May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Turner's lips tightened into a thin line. He had heard the words before, hands-free device, legal by law, but it didn't matter to him. She wasn't going to get away with this. It was clear in his eyes he wanted to assert his authority. And when someone challenged that authority, Turner didn't know how to back down. The irritation he had been holding back began to show on his face. "I don't care what you think is legal," he snapped, his patience running thin. His hand hovered near his belt, hovering over his baton, a silent threat hanging in the air. His fingers twitched as though itching to assert control in a way that Naomi hadn't anticipated. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Naomi didn't flinch. She wasn't afraid of his words nor his commands. She had spent years in a courtroom. She knew how to deal with pressure. But this wasn't a courtroom. This was a street, and it was clear Turner was playing by his own rules. Naomi could feel the shift in the atmosphere around her. He wasn't going to back down, and she wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of backing down either. "Officer, I'm not sure what's going on here. I'm trying to understand what the problem is. I'm not resisting. I'm not breaking any laws," Naomi said, keeping her voice even, though she could feel the weight of the moment. She had a feeling this was about something bigger than a simple traffic stop. Turner wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in control. Naomi, however, had learned over the years that keeping her composure was often her greatest asset. She couldn't let her emotions take over. It was too important to stay calm. But Turner wasn't listening. His jaw clenched as he stood there, seemingly weighing his options, but it was clear his mind was already made up. His impatience had grown, and the power he thought he wielded over the situation was slipping from his grasp. Naomi wasn't reacting as expected, and that threw him off. "Step out of the car now," Turner demanded, his voice escalating. Naomi's mind raced. She knew that complying without understanding the reason for her detention would be a mistake. She had rights, and those rights meant she didn't have to simply follow orders blindly. She wasn't about to let this man dictate the narrative. She was a professional, an attorney, trained to handle pressure and remain composed. But as she opened her door slowly, preparing to step out of the vehicle, Turner's patience snapped. Without warning, he reached forward, grabbing Naomi's arm with a harsh grip, twisting it behind her back as he pulled her forcefully from the car. Naomi gasped in pain, but she kept her composure. Her body stiffened against his hold, but she didn't resist. She couldn't afford to make a scene. Instead, she spoke calmly despite the suddenness of the force. "Officer, this is unnecessary," she said, her voice quiet, controlled. "I'm not resisting you. Please let go of my arm." But Turner's frustration had reached a boiling point. He didn't hear her. He was no longer seeing Naomi as a person. She had become a symbol of defiance, of someone not yielding to his authority. His grip on her arm tightened, his face flushed with anger as he shoved her against the side of her car. He could feel the growing tension from the onlookers, the pedestrians on the sidewalk, the drivers who had stopped at the light. He could feel their eyes on him. He knew he was being watched. Naomi's breath hitched for a moment as she was slammed against the car. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she remained focused. She could feel the weight of the moment settling in her chest. She knew that if this went any further, it wouldn't just be about her anymore. It would be about what the people around her witnessed. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been unfairly treated, for everyone who had been ignored. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer and obstruction," Turner declared, his voice almost robotic, as if it had been rehearsed in his head 100 times before. Naomi's mind raced. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't obstructed anything. She was following the law, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Turner had made up his mind. He wasn't looking for a reason to arrest her. He was looking for an excuse. The words hung in the air like a slap to the face, and Naomi felt the sting of injustice deep in her bones. As Turner grabbed the handcuffs from his belt, the world around them seemed to slow down. Naomi's thoughts were clear, steady. She knew that this wasn't just about her. This was bigger. It was about every person who had been unfairly detained, every person who had been silenced by those in power. She wasn't going to let this moment slip away without making it count. "Please, officer," Naomi said, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of the moment. "You're making a mistake." Turner's eyes didn't soften. His face was a mask of cold determination as he snapped the handcuffs on her wrists, tightening them with little regard for her comfort. He wasn't interested in her explanation anymore. He wasn't interested in anything but his own need to be in control. Naomi, meanwhile, had already calculated her next move. The footage from the bystanders was already being captured, and in that moment, Naomi realized the power of the moment she was in. She wasn't just a civil rights attorney. She was now a witness to her own mistreatment, a victim of the very system she fought to change. The crowd that had gathered began murmuring, some stepping closer, others pulling out their phones to capture the unfolding incident. Naomi didn't resist, but the growing tension in the air was palpable. People were witnessing something they hadn't expected, a woman who knew the law, who was composed, who was being treated as a criminal despite not breaking any law. They saw it for what it was, an abuse of power, a display of unchecked authority. As Turner completed the arrest, he barely seemed to notice the stares of the onlookers or the phones recording every moment. His mind was focused on the paperwork he would have to fill out later, on the satisfaction of putting someone in their place. But what Turner failed to realize was that this wasn't just another traffic stop. It wasn't just about a simple citation. The video would go viral, the story would spread, and this moment would become a symbol of the systemic issues within the justice system. Naomi's strength in the face of adversity would become her greatest weapon. And Turner, for all his arrogance, was blind to the storm he had just unleashed. As Naomi was placed in the back of the police car, she knew that this was only the beginning. By the time Naomi was placed in the back of the squad car, the ripple effect of her arrest had already begun to unfold. The video of her detainment, filmed by onlookers and quickly spread through social media, had ignited a firestorm. The clip, showing Naomi's calm and composed demeanor in stark contrast to Officer Turner's aggressive actions, had gone viral. It was everywhere. News outlets, both local and national, were picking up the story. Hashtags supporting Naomi's fight for justice trended across platforms, and the public outcry was growing louder by the minute. Among those who saw the video was attorney Anthony Graves, a well-known figure in Oak Ridge and beyond for his relentless fight against corruption and his unwavering commitment to justice. Graves had built a reputation as an attorney who never backed down in the face of injustice, particularly when it came to cases involving racial discrimination and police misconduct. His involvement in high-profile cases had earned him respect and admiration, but it had also made him enemies within the system. He had taken on corrupt politicians, unjust legal practices, and, in this case, a police department with a history of bias. As soon as Graves saw the video, he knew he couldn't let this go. This wasn't just about one woman being mistreated. It was about something much bigger. He immediately reached out to Naomi's legal team and demanded action. By the time the day had passed, he was standing outside the Oak Ridge Police Department, ready to demand justice. Graves strode through the front doors of the station with purpose. His sharp suit, composed demeanor, and commanding presence immediately drew the attention of those in the lobby. Conversations paused, and even the officers at the desk stood a little straighter, recognizing him instantly. He wasn't just any lawyer, he was a force. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't just represent clients. He represented movements, causes, and people who needed their voices amplified. And today, he was here to make sure Naomi Williams' voice was heard. "Attorney Graves, what can we do for you today?" the officer at the desk asked, trying to sound respectful but obviously nervous at the sudden appearance of someone so influential. "I'm here to see Naomi Williams," Graves said firmly, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for any sign of hesitation. "And I want the charges against her dropped immediately." The officer hesitated, looking around nervously, but Graves' reputation preceded him. It didn't take long for the officer to nod and motion for him to follow. Graves knew the situation wasn't going to be easy. He had dealt with far too many cases where the system was determined to cover its tracks. But he had never been one to back down, and he wasn't about to start now. Graves was led to the holding cells where Naomi was waiting. Naomi had been sitting quietly, her thoughts racing, but her outward calm remained intact. She knew what was at stake now. The video wasn't just going to be a momentary scandal. It was going to become a symbol. It was going to become the rallying cry for change. And Naomi had a feeling that, with Anthony Graves on her side, things were about to take a major turn. As Graves entered the holding area, Naomi stood up, her face breaking into a small but relieved smile when she saw him. There was no need for words. She knew he had come to her aid. "Naomi, are you all right?" Graves asked, his voice a mix of concern and resolve. "I'm fine, Marcus," Naomi replied, using his first name. She was still the professional, her voice steady despite the absurdity of the situation. "I just need to understand why this is happening." Graves nodded in understanding. He had already seen enough of the video to know what had happened. The footage didn't lie. Turner had gone too far. And now it was time to make him face the consequences of his actions. "I'm here to make sure this ends today," Graves said. "The charges against you will be dropped, and there will be an internal investigation into Officer Turner's conduct." Naomi's expression shifted slightly, a mix of gratitude and determination in her eyes. She had known that this wouldn't be a quick fix, but with Graves backing her, she now had a fighting chance. As Graves walked over to Officer Turner's desk, the atmosphere in the precinct seemed to shift. The bustling, familiar sounds of the station were replaced with a quiet tension. The officers who had been talking and laughing in the break room grew silent, aware that someone of importance had arrived. Graves' presence alone had a way of changing the mood in the room. His reputation preceded him, and now the officers could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Graves approached Turner's desk with purpose, his eyes cold and calculated as he locked his gaze on the officer. Turner looked up, his face immediately flushing with a mix of frustration and discomfort. He hadn't expected Graves to get involved. He thought the situation would blow over, that his actions would go unchecked, as they had so many times before. But now, here was Graves, standing before him, and it was clear that the consequences for his actions were going to be much greater than he had imagined. "Officer Turner," Graves began, his voice steady but laced with authority, "I demand to know why a woman who was doing nothing wrong was treated with such aggression. Why was she arrested for simply asking a question, for asserting her rights? What part of your training taught you to treat a citizen this way?" Turner opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. He had spent years in Oak Ridge, operating within a system that had always backed him up. But this was different. And deep down, he could feel it. This wasn't just about Naomi Williams anymore. Graves was right. It wasn't a personal issue. It was a systemic issue. "You don't get to act like you're above the law," Graves continued, his voice sharp. "This isn't just about your behavior, Turner. This is part of a larger problem, one that I've been fighting against for years. Your actions are a reflection of a system that is broken, a system that needs to be reformed." The words hung in the air, and Turner could feel the weight of them bearing down on him. He had always believed that his badge was a shield, that his authority was unassailable. But now, as Graves stood in front of him, he began to realize just how wrong he had been. Graves wasn't just criticizing Turner's actions. He was calling out the very institution that had allowed those actions to happen in the first place. The larger system of bias, abuse of power, and racial prejudice within the Oak Ridge Police Department. Turner's breath quickened as the full gravity of the situation hit him. This wasn't just a bad day at work. This was the beginning of something much bigger. "I will be filing a formal complaint," Graves said, his tone final, "and I will be pushing for a full investigation into Officer Turner's conduct. There will be accountability. This ends now." Turner swallowed hard. He had expected resistance, but not this. Not from someone like Graves. And in that moment, as Graves turned away to address the rest of the officers in the precinct, Turner knew his career was on the line. He had no idea how far Graves would take this, but one thing was certain: he had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. As Graves left the Oak Ridge police station, the sense of power and authority he carried with him lingered in the air. Naomi Williams was going to walk out of here a free woman, and Officer Turner was going to have to face the consequences of his actions. The battle was far from over, but it had taken a significant turn. Graves had made it clear the system would not protect Turner this time. The aftermath of Naomi Williams' arrest spread like wildfire. What had started as a routine traffic stop had turned into something far more significant. A single video, captured by bystanders, had exposed the truth behind Officer Jason Turner's actions, and the world was watching. Within hours of the footage going viral, news outlets from around the country began to pick up the story. Headlines blared: "Black woman arrested by officer in unwarranted traffic stop," "Oak Ridge police under fire for racial profiling," and "Civil rights advocate wrongfully detained." The video of Naomi's calm composure and Turner's aggressive behavior spread across social media, sparking debates about systemic racism and police abuse of power. As the story gained momentum, the Oak Ridge Police Department found itself under intense scrutiny. Civil rights groups, justice organizations, and local community leaders spoke out in support of Naomi, demanding accountability. Protests erupted in various parts of Oak Ridge, with people marching to the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Naomi," "Stop police brutality," and "End racial profiling now." At the center of this growing storm stood Officer Turner, who, just a few days ago, had been a fixture of the Oak Ridge Police Department, a man whose authority was rarely questioned. But now, the entire community was questioning his actions, and the weight of their anger was impossible to ignore. Inside the Oak Ridge Police Department, things were changing too. The public outcry had forced the department to respond, but it wasn't just a simple apology that would appease the masses. It was clear that this was no ordinary incident. It was a symptom of a much deeper problem within the department. The department's leadership, trying to save face and avoid further damage to their reputation, issued a public statement acknowledging the concerns. The statement promised that the Oak Ridge Police Department would implement new retraining programs focused on racial bias and community engagement. This was a start, but it wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough until Turner was held accountable for his actions, and the community knew it. Turner, for the first time in his career, found himself suspended from duty. The police department had no choice but to take action in the face of the overwhelming evidence and public pressure. The suspension was immediate, and an internal investigation was launched into his conduct during the incident. But the damage was already done. Turner's actions had shattered the trust that the community had in him, and no amount of internal investigation could undo that. As Turner sat at home, nursing the humiliation of his suspension, the voices of the community grew louder. The internal investigation into his actions had barely begun, but the public wasn't waiting. Naomi Williams had become a symbol of the fight against injustice, and the people of Oak Ridge weren't going to let this issue slide. They demanded justice, not just for Naomi, but for everyone who had ever felt the sting of unfair treatment at the hands of the police. Across social media, civil rights organizations called for change. The hashtag Justice for Naomi trended nationwide, with activists from all over the country voicing their support. "This isn't just one bad cop," one activist wrote on Twitter. "This is the system that allows it to happen. We need to hold the whole department accountable." Others shared personal stories of their own encounters with police officers, recounting similar experiences of discrimination, intimidation, and abuse of power. Turner's actions had brought these stories to the surface, and now the call for reform was stronger than ever. Back in Oak Ridge, local community leaders held town halls, organizing peaceful protests and discussions about police reform. They called for a complete overhaul of the way the police department interacted with the community. They demanded more transparency, more accountability, and a commitment to ending racial profiling and systemic bias. As the days passed, the pressure mounted. Naomi had become the face of a larger movement, and the community was standing behind her. In the midst of all this, Naomi remained calm and resolute. She had already known what it felt like to fight for justice, but now she was fighting for something bigger. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless others who had been mistreated, silenced, or ignored. Naomi knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The internal investigation would take time, and Turner's suspension didn't guarantee he would face criminal charges. But the outcry from the community, the media, and civil rights organizations had already forced the conversation about police reform into the public spotlight, and Naomi was determined to make sure it stayed there. As she walked through the protests, surrounded by her supporters, Naomi couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. She had been just one voice, but now she was part of a chorus calling for change. The fight wasn't over. But with the support of the people around her and the growing momentum of the movement, Naomi felt a renewed sense of hope. Inside the Oak Ridge Police Department, however, the mood was much different. Officers whispered among themselves, some of them already eyeing Turner with suspicion. His suspension had left a gap in the department, and many of his colleagues began to wonder if they would be next. Would their actions be scrutinized as well? Would their own behavior be questioned in the same way? Turner, once confident in his authority, now found himself isolated, with no allies to back him up. His fellow officers, who had once turned a blind eye to his behavior, now looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. The culture of silence that had allowed Turner to operate unchecked for so long had crumbled, and with it, his career. The investigation would take time, but the community wasn't willing to wait. They wanted immediate change, not just in Turner's case, but in the way the police department operated as a whole. The people of Oak Ridge were no longer willing to turn a blind eye to the issues of racial bias and police misconduct. And with Naomi's leadership and the support of civil rights groups, the demand for accountability was louder than ever. The winds of change had begun to blow through Oak Ridge, and this time they weren't going to stop. The consequences for Officer Turner were just the beginning. The real work, the work of reforming the system, of holding police officers accountable, of ensuring that no one else would have to endure what Naomi had experienced, was just getting started. The following days after Naomi Williams' arrest were filled with tension, anger, and determination, but also with hope. What began as a single, unfair traffic stop had blossomed into a full-blown movement, one that captured the hearts and minds of people across Oak Ridge, the country, and beyond. Naomi's calm yet unwavering response to Officer Turner's aggression had turned her into more than just a victim. She had become a symbol, a beacon for all those who had suffered under the weight of unjust treatment, racial profiling, and abuse of power. On the day she was released from custody, Naomi knew that her fight was far from over. It wasn't just about proving that she hadn't broken the law. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed incidents like hers to happen in the first place. The police department had suspended Officer Turner, and an investigation was underway, but Naomi had a bigger vision. She had never been one to stand by quietly, and now, with the public's attention focused squarely on her, she knew it was her time to speak. She stood before a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing as her story continued to make headlines. Behind her, a sea of supporters gathered, community members, civil rights activists, and everyday people who had been touched by her strength. Naomi took a deep breath, her resolve solidifying as she walked up to the podium. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had faced injustice, who had been silenced, and who had been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin. "My name is Naomi Williams," she began, her voice clear and steady. "And what happened to me is not just my story. It is the story of countless others who have been unfairly treated, oppressed, and silenced by a system that was supposed to protect them." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I've spent my life fighting for justice, fighting for those who don't have a voice. But today, I stand before you not just as a civil rights attorney, but as a person who has been caught in the same broken system we've all been fighting against for years. The system that allows officers like Jason Turner to use their power to control, intimidate, and harm people who look like me." Her words echoed through the crowd, and the tension that had been building for days seemed to swell to a breaking point. Naomi's story had struck a chord, not just in Oak Ridge but across the country. People who had never known her were now standing with her, sharing her outrage and her hope for a better future. "This fight is not only about me," Naomi continued, her voice rising with the fervor of someone who had seen too much injustice. "It's about all those who have been wronged by the system. It's about the people who have been denied their rights because of the color of their skin. It's about the young black men and women who are too often treated like criminals because of the way they look. And it's about the communities that live in fear, knowing that the very people who are supposed to protect them are the ones they have to fear the most." She paused again, her eyes scanning the crowd, making sure they understood the gravity of what she was saying. "We cannot continue to turn a blind eye to what is happening. We cannot let this be another story that fades into the background while the system continues to operate unchecked. We need change, and we need it now." Naomi's words were not just a call to action, they were a demand. A demand for accountability, a demand for justice, a demand for reform. "I call on the Oak Ridge Police Department to hold its officers to a higher standard, to ensure that those who take an oath to serve and protect are actually doing so. I call on our government to implement major reforms within the police system. We need better training, better oversight, and a commitment to addressing the racial biases that have been allowed to fester for far too long." The crowd erupted into applause, and Naomi felt a surge of energy rush through her. The fight was no longer just hers. It was the fight of an entire community, an entire nation that was tired of seeing people of color treated like second-class citizens. Her words were igniting a fire, and Naomi could feel the collective power of everyone who was standing behind her. "We cannot wait for change to come," Naomi continued, her voice firm with conviction. "We cannot wait for the next tragedy to unfold before we demand accountability. It is time to act. It is time to take back our communities and demand a system that works for everyone, not just for those who have power." Her speech reverberated far beyond the crowd in front of her. It was broadcast on news stations, shared widely on social media, and discussed in living rooms and workplaces all over Oak Ridge and the country. Naomi had become more than just an attorney. She had become the face of a revolution. People who had felt powerless for so long were now finding their voices, inspired by Naomi's courage and the clarity of her message. Civil rights groups from across the nation pledged their support. Justice organizations organized marches, protests, and campaigns calling for immediate action. In Oak Ridge, local leaders began meeting with community members, discussing ways to create meaningful change in the police department and ensure that incidents like Naomi's would never happen again. But for Naomi, the fight was just beginning. She knew that change wouldn't come overnight. She knew that there would be resistance, that there would be people who would try to silence her, to discredit her. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had the support of the community, the backing of people who were just as tired of the status quo as she was. As the days went on, Naomi became a symbol of resilience, a woman who had faced injustice head-on and refused to back down. Her story was no longer just about an incident between one police officer and one black woman. It had become a symbol of a larger battle for justice and equality. And with every speech, every protest, every conversation, Naomi inspired more people to join the fight. "I don't want to be remembered as the woman who was wrongfully detained," Naomi said in an interview a few weeks later. "I want to be remembered as the woman who stood up for what was right, who stood up for every person who has been silenced, and who helped lead a movement that changed the world." Her words rang true. Naomi Williams had become more than just a symbol. She had become a movement that called for justice, for fairness, and for a future where no one would ever have to fight for their rights the way she had. A movement that believed, with everything in it, that society could change, and that, together, they could build a better, fairer future for everyone.